The gun was already in his hand when Charlotte Turner slammed the deed down on the kitchen table between them, her breath coming in ragged pulls, her dark eyes blazing with something that went far beyond fury. It was betrayal she wore on her face, raw and bleeding, and it stopped Matthew Sheridan cold in the doorway of his own ranch house, the late afternoon sun cutting a hard angle through the window and laying a stripe of gold across the damning document. "You knew," she said. Her voice was quiet, which was somehow worse than screaming. "You knew who I was when you hired me. You knew who my father was. And you let me stay here for 3 months believing you were just a decent man in need of a housekeeper." Matthew set the gun down on the counter with a deliberate slowness, like a man diffusing something volatile, which he was. He was diffusing her, and he knew it, and she hated him for that too. "Charlotte, do not say my name like that." She pressed her finger to the deed, to the signature inked across the bottom in her father's spidery hand. Elias Turner signed over 20 acres of the Sheridan land claim in 1878 as payment for a gambling debt. "Your land, your father's land, and my father was the man who cheated him out of it." She pulled her hand back. "I read the court documents in Laramie while I was getting your supplies. I am not stupid, Matthew. I am never going to be stupid about this." The silence between them was enormous. It filled the ranch house the way smoke fills a room, slow and suffocating, finding every corner. "I did not hire you because of your father," he said finally. "Then why did you hire me?" He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived in Cheyenne territory on a rattling stagecoach in March of 1883 with one trunk, a letter of introduction from a pastor in Missouri, and a spine made of something harder than iron. He thought about all the things he had fixed on this ranch in the 2 years since his father died and left him with a broken fence line, a house with a collapsed porch, a barn that leaked like a colander, and a well that had nearly run dry. He thought about every nail he had driven, every board he had replaced, every dry season he had survived on stubbornness alone, and he thought about the one thing he had not been able to fix. "I will tell you everything," he said, "but not like this. Sit down, please." "I will stand, then stand." He pulled a chair out for himself and sat at the table across from the deed, from the evidence of all the secrets that had been quietly building between them like a dam. "It started with my father." This is how Charlotte Turner came to be standing in a ranch house in the Wyoming territory in the spring of 1883, holding her entire life in her hands like broken glass. She had left Missouri in February, 6 weeks after her father died, owing money to half the county, and leaving her with a farm that the bank had already begun to circle like a patient bird. Elias Turner had been a charming man and a terrible one, the kind of man who could talk a room into loving him and then quietly pick their pockets while they were smiling. Charlotte had known this about him since she was old enough to understand what the nervous looks between her mother and the neighbors at church really meant. Her mother, God rest her gentle soul, had died when Charlotte was 16, and after that it was just the two of them, father and daughter, and the careful performance of a normal life. She was 26 years old when he died. She was 26 years old when she discovered that the farm, the furniture, the horses, and even the silver that had been her grandmother's were all spoken for. She had exactly $11 and the clothes she could pack into a single trunk, and a stubborn refusal to become dependent on the charity of people who had always half-pitied her anyway. She had answered an advertisement in the Missouri Courier. "Ranch in Wyoming territory seeks capable housekeeper. Salary, room and board references required. 3 years minimum commitment preferred. Apply to M. Sheridan, Laramie Post Office, Wyoming Territory." She had written the best letter of her life. She had included the pastor's reference and a description of her skills that was accurate if perhaps slightly optimistic regarding her experience with cattle. She had received a reply in 2 weeks that was exactly 17 words long. "Position is yours if you can be in Cheyenne by March. Bring warm clothes. M. Sheridan." That was not a man prone to wasted words. She had taken the train to the end of the line and the stagecoach the rest of the way, and arrived in Cheyenne on a Tuesday morning when the wind was brutal and the sky was the color of old pewter. Matthew Sheridan had been waiting at the depot. She had known him immediately because he was the only man standing still in a yard full of movement, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair going a little silver at the temples, and eyes the color of the sky just before a serious storm. He was 34 years old, and he looked like a man who had been responsible for things his entire life and had stopped expecting anyone to share that weight. He had looked at her and said, without preamble, "You are smaller than I expected." She had looked back and said, "You are quieter than I expected." Something had shifted in his expression then. Not a smile exactly, but the shadow of one, the kind that only appears when something genuinely surprises a person. "The wagon is this way," he said. That had been the beginning. The Sheridan Ranch sat on 240 acres of Wyoming grassland, backed by a ridge of low hills that turned purple in the evening and golden in the mornings. There was a main house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, a chicken coop that was listing at a slight angle, and a bunkhouse that currently housed 2 hands. A man named Roy Calloway, who was 60-something and chewed tobacco with the philosophical patience of a man who had seen everything twice, and a younger man named Danny Vega, who was perhaps 22, and had come up from New Mexico the previous summer and never found a compelling reason to leave. The house itself was clean but barren, the way a place looks when it has been maintained out of discipline rather than love. There were no curtains. The kitchen was functional but joyless. There was a good wood stove and a solid table and chairs, and a bedroom upstairs that Matthew had clearly cleared out for her, and a bedroom at the end of the hall where she understood he slept, and nothing on the walls anywhere except for one small oval photograph hung beside the front door that showed a man and a woman she did not recognize, formal and unsmiling the way people were in photographs. "Your parents?" she had asked, looking at it. "Yes," he had said, and that was all. She had set to work immediately because that was who she was, a woman who answered difficulty with action. She made curtains from fabric she found in a trunk in the second outbuilding. She rearranged the kitchen so that it made sense to use. She planted a kitchen garden in the strip of ground beside the south wall of the house. She discovered that the chimney in the parlor was partially blocked and arranged for Roy to help her clear it. She made bread and pies and slow-cooked stews, and she kept the accounts Matthew brought to her with a meticulous accuracy that made him look at her with an expression that was almost unsettling in its intensity, the first time he saw what she had done with 3 months of tangled numbers. "Where did you learn to do this?" he had asked. "My father owed money to a great many people," she had said. "I learned to understand money very well in self-defense." She had not told him the full truth of that. Not then. What happened between them over those 3 months was not simple or sudden. It was the kind of thing that builds in layers, like sediment, each small moment depositing something invisible until the accumulated weight becomes undeniable. It was the way he never spoke to her as though her opinion was secondary. It was the way she always had coffee ready when he came in from the morning rounds. Not because it was her job, but because she noticed he was always cold in the mornings even when he did not say so. It was the long evenings when the ranch hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, and they sat across from each other at the kitchen table, him with his ledgers and her with her mending, and the silence was not empty but full of something that neither of them had named yet. It was the evening in April when a late storm rolled in off the mountains and knocked a section of the barn roof down, and she had gone out with a lantern in the wind and rain without being asked because she knew the horses would be frightened, and she had found him already there, calming them, and he had looked up and seen her standing in the door soaked through, and holding the lantern steady in the gale, and something in his face had gone completely unguarded for just a moment before he had looked away. It was the morning she found him at the kitchen table before dawn, just sitting in the dark with his hands around a cold coffee cup, not moving, and she had lit the lamp without speaking and put a fresh cup in front of him and sat down across from him and waited, and after a long time he had said, My father died in this chair, right here. I came in one morning and he was just gone. Heart gave out in the night. I keep thinking I should move the chair and I never do. Why not? She had asked quietly. Because I am not ready to stop being sorry, he had said. She had not asked him what he was sorry for. She had simply sat with him in the lamplight until the sky outside began to lighten, and that had been more intimate than anything she had experienced in her life. And now she was standing in this kitchen with a deed in her hand, and the specific cold horror of realizing that a man she had begun to trust might have a hidden motive she had missed entirely. My father borrowed money from yours, Matthew said. He had his hands flat on the table, not defensive, just present. In 1876. Your father, Elias Turner, had a reputation for certain kinds of dealings. My father, William Sheridan, was not a worldly man. He was a good rancher and a poor judge of character in business. He lost 20 acres of this property in a card game your father arranged, and the loss was not clean. There was a witness who would later testify that the deck had been altered. Charlotte said nothing. She knew this was true because she had read the court filing, had seen the witness testimony, had seen her father's name written in the cold language of legal wrongdoing. The case was never properly adjudicated, Matthew continued. Your father moved on before it could be. The 20 acres remained in his name on the territorial record. After he died, the parcel reverted to his estate, which meant it passed to you as his only heir. He looked at her steadily. You own 20 acres of my ranch, Charlotte. You have owned it since February. She sat down, not because she wanted to, but because her legs made the decision for her. You knew this, she said. I knew it before I sent you the letter. Then why? Because I had two choices, he said. I could hire a lawyer in Laramie and spend 2 years and whatever money I have trying to untangle a 20-year-old land dispute with a woman I had never met who was probably not even aware she had inherited a contested parcel. Or, he paused, or I could invite you here, let you see the land, understand what it is, and then try to work something out between two people who both had legitimate grievances instead of letting lawyers make it ugly. Charlotte stared at him. That is either the most calculating thing I have ever heard or the most idealistic. I am a practical man, he said. I do not have money for lawyers, and I had a ranch that genuinely needed a housekeeper. A pause. Both things were true, but you should have told me. Yes, no hesitation, I should have. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. I think what I was actually doing was waiting until it did not matter as much, which is a coward strategy, and I know it. She absorbed this. Outside, the evening wind was picking up, running its hands along the eaves of the house with a low moan. The lamp on the table between them flickered. Why would it matter less? She asked. He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, You know why, Charlotte? She knew. Of course she knew. She had known for at least a month, the way you know a storm is coming before the clouds arrive, a pressure change in the air, something in the light. She had known it, and she had been very carefully not looking at it directly, the way you avoid looking at the sun. That is not a fair thing to say, she said, when you have been keeping a secret this size. No, he agreed. It is not fair. None of this is fair. My father lost land he earned. Your father took it by cheating. You inherited a debt and a problem you did not create. I kept information from you that you had a right to. Not one piece of this is fair. He leaned forward slightly. But I am asking you to tell me what you want to do, not what is fair. What you want. Charlotte looked at the deed for a long time. 20 acres. A strip of eastern pasture she had walked across a dozen times without knowing it was technically hers. Good grass land, the kind of ground that held water well. She thought about what 20 acres was worth. She thought about what $11 had bought her. She thought about what it meant that she had spent 3 months building something in this house, making it livable, making it feel inhabited by more than discipline. And now she was being told the whole arrangement had a hidden motive underneath it. But she also thought about the man sitting across from her, who had been honest when the truth caught up with him, who had not lied when she gave him every opportunity to, who had put his hands flat on the table like a man with nothing left to hide. She stood up and folded the deed and put it in the pocket of her apron. "I am going to start supper," she said. "And in the morning, I want to walk the eastern pasture with you, and you are going to show me exactly where the boundary falls. And then we are going to have a real conversation about what comes next. But not tonight." Matthew Sheridan watched her cross to the stove and begin to move with the quiet efficiency that he had come to think of as one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen in his life. This woman making something out of nothing, making a space livable, making a cold place warm. He thought about the 20 acres and the hidden motive he had carried for months. He thought about what he had almost lost tonight. "Charlotte," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I am sorry," he said. "Not about the land, about not trusting you with the truth sooner. You deserved better than that." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I did." And she turned back to the stove. It was not forgiveness, not yet. But it was a door left open, and Matthew Sheridan had learned enough about the value of things on this ranch to know not to waste an open door. The conversation they had the next morning was nothing like what Charlotte had planned for it to be, because the morning came in with trouble. Roy found it at first light, a cut fence line on the eastern boundary, and 3 of the best cattle gone through the gap. The tracks in the soft earth were clear enough, cattle moving east in a deliberate path, which meant they had been moved, not drifted. "Rustlers," Danny said, reading the tracks with the focused attention of someone who had grown up near the border and understood what stolen livestock meant to people who had nothing to spare. "Move them in the night. There are boot marks here, see, 2 men at least." Matthew looked at the cut wire and felt the particular fury of a man who has worked too hard for too long to have things taken from him. But he kept it in his chest, compressed and cold, because fury in the open leads to mistakes. "Roy, ride to the Hendersons and ask if they have seen anything on their north range. Danny, follow the tracks east as far as the creek, then come back. Do not engage anyone." He looked at them both. "I mean that, come back." He rode back to the house and found Charlotte already in the yard, her dark hair pinned up and her sleeves rolled to the elbows, looking at him with an expression that read the situation from his face without him saying a word. "How many?" she asked. 3 head, good ones. One of them is the bull. The bull was worth more than the other 2 combined, a fact that made the lining of Matthew's stomach cold. "What do you need me to do?" she asked. Not "Are you all right?" Not "I am sorry." What do you need? He had noticed this about her early on, the directness, the refusal to waste time on sympathy when action was available. "I need you to stay in the house," he said, "and I need you to know where the shotgun is." She gave him a look that said she was already aware of where the shotgun was and that she was perfectly capable of using it. Which he knew was true because he had seen her take a rattlesnake out of the garden with a hoe and a complete lack of visible fear. "Be careful," she said, just that. He rode east. The tracks led him 5 miles across the open grassland to a place where the creek bent south around a stand of cottonwood trees, and there, tied to a makeshift post driven into the bank, were his 3 cattle, and beside them was a situation far more complicated than simple rustlers. There were 4 men. 2 of them wore the look of hired hands who had fallen into bad work, the hungry-eyed, pinch-faced look of men who stole because opportunity presented itself. But the other 2 were men Matthew recognized, and his jaw set hard when he saw them. Wade Connors and his brother Hale, who ran a spread 30 miles south and had been trying to buy the eastern pasture of the Sheridan Ranch for 3 years. Wade Connors, who had made offers that got progressively less polite over time. Wade Connors, who had sent a man to the Laramie Land Office to inquire about the contested status of the Turner parcel, which was how Charlotte had found the court documents, because she had gone to the land office the same day, and the clerk had mentioned, in the way that board clerks do, that she was the second person that week to ask about the Sheridan Turner claim. Everything shifted in Charlotte's mind when Matthew told her this that evening. She had not made the connection before, had not known about Connors, but now she sat at the kitchen table with a clarity that was almost physical in its weight, all the pieces arranging themselves into a picture she wished she could unsee. Connors arranged the rustling, she said, not to keep the cattle, to destabilize you, to push you into a financial position where you would have to sell. That is what I believe, Matthew said. He had gotten the cattle back, because Connors was a coward and Matthew had faced them down alone, and neither of the hired hands had been willing to escalate to violence over a dispute their employer had manufactured, and they had left with the particular haste of men who have just remembered they have somewhere better to be. Connors himself had been bluster without follow-through, which Matthew had gambled on and been right about. But the confrontation had a harder edge to it than he had let on to Charlotte, because Connors had said something before he rode away that was still sitting in Matthew's chest like a stone. He had said, "The woman you have up at that house, Sheridan, she owns a piece of your land, you know that, right? And when she leaves, which she will, that piece goes with her or we find a way to buy it from her. One way or another, I am getting that eastern pasture." Matthew had not told Charlotte that part yet. He was telling her now. She took it in silence. Then she said, "He thinks I am temporary." "Yes." She looked at the table for a moment, then she looked up. "He is going to try to contact me. Make me an offer for the parcel." "Almost certainly. What do you want me to do when he does?" Matthew looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them, the same lamp that had been between them last night when the whole hidden motive had come out into the light. He thought about what Connors had said. He thought about the 20 acres of good pasture that Charlotte Turner technically owned. He thought about a trap being laid by a greedy man who thought he understood the situation. "I want to tell you something," Matthew said. "And I want you to understand that I am telling you this separately from the land problem. Separately from Connors and from my father's debt and from all of it." Charlotte waited. "I have fixed a great many things on this ranch," he said. "The fence, the barn, the porch, the well, the chimney, the accounts." He paused, but not the loneliness, not until now. His voice was level, but there was nothing level about his eyes. "I am not asking you anything tonight. I'm not saying it to manipulate you or to make the land question easier. I am saying it because I have been holding it in my chest since about April, and I am a practical man, but I am apparently not that practical." Charlotte Turner sat very still for a long moment. She thought about her father, who had charmed people and used them. She thought about how good she had become at recognizing hidden motives, at looking for the angle in everything, because her childhood had trained her to. She thought about how she had come to this ranch already wounded by a lifetime of watching love be used as a tool for getting things, and how that had made her careful, and how careful had sometimes shaded into suspicious, and how suspicious had made her read the worst version of this man's silence when maybe, the truth was simpler and more frightening than betrayal. She thought about April, when she had stood in the barn doorway in the rain with a lamp, and the look on his face. "I am going to say something," she said, "and I want you to let me finish before you respond." "All right. I came here with nothing," she said. "I came here running from a life I did not choose and a legacy I was ashamed of. I came here to work, to earn something, to build something that was actually mine. And I found," she stopped, collected herself. "I found that you are a man who is decent all the way through, not just on the surface. I found that I can breathe here in a way I could not in Missouri. I found that I have been," she looked down at her hands, "I have been happy here, in a way I did not expect and did not plan for." The lamp between them burned steady. "And I am afraid," she said quietly. "I am afraid that I want things here that I am not sure I have the right to want, because everything is complicated and there is land between us, and your honesty came late and my father's shadow is long." She looked up at him. "But I think you are telling me the truth right now, and I think that matters more than the complications." Matthew said, "What do you want, Charlotte?" quietly. The same question he had asked last night, but it meant something entirely different now. She said, "I want to stay." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and neither of them spoke, and the lamp burned, and outside the Wyoming night was enormous and full of stars. The complication of Wade Connors did not disappear because of what passed between them at the kitchen table. Real problems have a way of remaining real regardless of what the heart decides. Connors arrived at the ranch 3 days later, not at the main house, but at the crossroads a mile south, where Charlotte happened to be driving the wagon back from the small supply store in Cutter Creek. He rode up alongside her with the practiced ease of a man who planned his encounters, flanked by one of the hired hands who had been at the creek when Matthew faced them down, which Charlotte recognized and noted with a cold precision. Connors himself was a large man with a prosperous look and the particular kind of smile that lives only on the face and never reaches the eyes. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Forgive me, Miss Turner, is it? I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." Charlotte held the reins steady and looked at him without expression. "You have 30 seconds of it." He laughed as though she had said something charming. "I understand you have a legal claim to a parcel on the Sheridan property. Eastern pasture, 20 acres, very good grass land. I am prepared to make you a fair offer for that parcel. Cash money, which I understand you are not currently oversupplied with." Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the trap that Connors had been laying for months. She thought about the cut fence and the stolen cattle and the hidden motive wrapped inside what he was presenting as neighborly business. She thought about what it meant that he had approached her alone on a road rather than coming to the ranch house, that he had chosen this moment and this location deliberately because he thought she was more vulnerable away from Matthew. She thought about her father, who had been a man exactly like this, without the rancher's coat and with a card table instead of a pasture, but identical in structure, the smile, the angle, the assessment of what the other person needed and how to use it. "No," she said. Connors's smile did not change, but something behind it did. "You have not heard the figure." "I do not need to. The answer is no. Miss Turner, I want to help you here. Sheridan is a difficult man. He is not going to make this easy for you. You are sitting on an asset that, Mr. Connors," she said, in the same quiet voice she had used with Matthew the night of the confrontation, which apparently carried because the hired hand behind Connors shifted in his saddle. "I am going to say this once. I know what you did to his fence line. I know why you did it. I know what you are doing right now and why you chose this location. If you or your men come onto the Sheridan property again without a legal invitation, I will personally ride to Laramie and file a complaint with the territorial marshal's office. And the 20 acres you want will never be available to you regardless of what figure you name, because in the morning I am going to sign them back to the Sheridan estate in the presence of a notary." She clicked to the horse and drove on. She could feel Connors watching her back the entire way down the road, and she kept her spine straight and her hands steady on the reins, and she did not let herself shake until she was around the bend and out of his sight, and then she allowed herself 30 seconds of pure terror before she put it away and drove home. Matthew was in the yard when she arrived, and he read her face as he always did, with a quickness that still sometimes startled her. "Connors," he said. "Yes." She handed him the reins and climbed down. "I told him no. Charlotte, I am going to Laramie tomorrow. I need a notary." He went very still. "You do not have to do that." "I know I do not have to." She looked at him directly. "I am doing it because those 20 acres belong here. They belong to this ranch. They were taken by my father through deception, and I have no right to profit from his dishonesty. And I do not want anything between us that could be used by a man like Connors as a wedge." She paused. "I am also doing it because I made a decision 3 nights ago, and I intend to stand behind it." He looked at her for a long time. The evening light was doing what Wyoming evening light does, turning everything copper and rose, and Charlotte Turner, standing in the yard of his ranch with her chin up and her eyes clear, was the most formidable and beautiful sight he had encountered in his 34 years on the earth. "Come inside," he said, very quietly. "I need to tell you something." They went inside, and he told her that he had already spoken to Roy Calloway about the situation and that Roy, who had been working this land since Matthew's father's time and knew every acre of it the way he knew his own hands, had suggested the same solution. He told her that he had drafted a document with Roy's help proposing a formal arrangement, Not just the land transfer, but something more. He spread the paper on the table and let her read it. It was not a legal document. It was not written in legal language. It was written in Matthew Sheridan's plain, direct hand, and what it said was this: that he proposed a partnership in the ranch, not as an employer and employee, not as a landowner and a housekeeper, but as two people who intended to build something together, with equal voice in the decisions and equal stake in the outcome. And at the bottom, below where two signatures would go, he had written, "I am aware that this proposal requires you to trust a man who kept a secret from you. I am asking you to trust the version of me you have seen every day for 3 months rather than the version who was afraid. I believe they are the same person." Charlotte read it twice. She looked up. "This is not a legal document," she said. "No, a legal document comes after. This is me asking." She pulled the deed from her apron pocket, the same one she had been carrying for 3 days, and laid it on the table next to his paper. "Then yes," she said. The trip to Laramie took 2 days, because the roads in Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1883 were not accommodating to fast travel. Matthew drove the wagon and Charlotte sat beside him, and they talked for 6 hours each way in the manner of two people who have been keeping their words carefully back, and are now discovering that there are a great many of them stored up, ready to come out. She told him about her mother, who had been quietly brilliant and quietly miserable, and who had loved her husband in spite of understanding exactly what he was. She told him about learning to keep the accounts because her father's financial disasters needed someone to manage them, and about how she had discovered that numbers made a particular kind of sense to her, a clean and honest sense that contrasted with everything else in that household. She told him about the year after her mother died, and the 3 suitors her father had tried to arrange for her, each one for a reason that had nothing to do with her happiness and everything to do with some debt he needed to retire. Matthew listened, truly listened, in the way that she had noticed about him early and had come to value enormously, the complete and focused attention he gave when she spoke, as though what she was saying mattered and he did not want to miss any of it. He told her about his father, William Sheridan, who had come to Wyoming from Ohio in 1865 with $50 and an absolute certainty that land was the only thing that could not be argued with. He told her about growing up on the ranch, learning it board by board and acre by acre, learning to read the weather and the grass and the water table. He told her about his mother, who had died of a fever when Matthew was 19, and how the ranch house had changed after that, become more austere, more purely functional, his father working harder and speaking less. He told her about coming back from 2 years in Colorado, where he had worked on another man's spread learning different techniques, to find his father thinner and older than the time should have made him, and about the last 3 years of his father's life, which had been good years, the kind made better by being present for them. He was sorry about the land, Matthew said on the 2nd day of driving, with Laramie just visible in the distance as a smear of smoke and buildings against the plain. Not in the way that makes a man small. He told me once that losing those 20 acres to Turner's scheme had hurt his pride more than his operation, and that pride was a thing a man should hold loosely. I think he meant it as advice. "Did it work?" Charlotte asked. He glanced at her with the shadow of that smile. "I am still working on it." The notary in Laramie was a small man named Hutchins who smelled of pipe tobacco and took his work very seriously. The transfer of the contested 20 acres from Charlotte Turner to the Sheridan estate took 45 minutes to complete properly, and Hutchins made them wait while he checked the original land records against the court filing and satisfied himself that everything was in order. When it was done and the document was signed and sealed, he looked at them both over his spectacles with an expression that suggested he had seen a great many transactions in his time, and this one had an unusual quality to it. "Unusual for someone to give land away," he observed. "My father took it improperly," Charlotte said. "I am returning it." Hutchins nodded slowly. "Admirable," he said. "Not common," but admirable. They ate dinner at the hotel in Laramie that evening because the return trip was too far to start before morning. The hotel dining room was the finest establishment Charlotte had been in since Missouri, with white tablecloths and gas lamps, and a menu that listed actual options rather than whatever happened to be available. Matthew looked slightly uncomfortable with it, in the way of a man who spends most of his time outdoors and finds formal indoor spaces mildly suspicious. Charlotte ordered the roasted chicken and watched him study the menu with the focused expression he brought to everything. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. He looked up. "Whether I am going to do this correctly." "Order the beef," she said. "You have been wanting it since you read it." He ordered the beef. The food was good, and the conversation ranged widely. And at some point between the main course and the coffee, Charlotte realized that she was happy in a way that was not contingent on anything. Not on the ranch being safe, or the land dispute resolved, or Connors having been dealt with. Just happy in the specific and ordinary way of being at a table with someone whose company you want. It was, she thought, the best feeling she had experienced in a very long time. They stayed at the hotel and were back on the road to Cutter Creek by 7 in the morning, and Matthew drove with an ease and silence that Charlotte had learned to read as contentment rather than withdrawal. The Wyoming spring was insisting on itself around them, the grass coming in vivid against the pale road, the sky enormous and clear. "I want to ask you something," Matthew said, about 2 hours outside of Laramie. "Ask." "What you told Connors on the road." "That you had made a decision 3 nights ago and intended to stand behind it." He kept his eyes on the road. "I want to know what that decision was exactly, what it means to you, not what I am hoping it means. What it actually means." Charlotte considered this. She appreciated that he asked it this way, drawing the distinction between what he hoped and what she actually intended, giving her the room to be honest rather than simply agreeable. "It means," she said carefully, "that I came here with nothing and I found something worth having. It means that I am choosing to trust the evidence of my own 3 months over the fear that my father's legacy makes me bad at reading people." She paused. "It means that I would like to stay, not as a housekeeper," as she paused again, "as someone with a stake in what this ranch becomes." "A partnership," he said. "Yes," she looked at him. "Is that what you meant by the document?" "The document was a beginning," he said. "I am a direct man, Charlotte. I do not like things left ambiguous. What I mean, what I have meant since I wrote that document, is that I would like to marry you, if that is something you would consider." Charlotte Turner sat on the wagon seat on a dirt road in Wyoming Territory in 1883 and looked at Matthew Sheridan, who was looking back at her with an expression that was completely unguarded and therefore completely terrifying to him. She could see that, could see the vulnerability in a man who was not in the habit of being vulnerable. "That is considerably more than a partnership," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at the road ahead. She thought about all the things she had run from and all the things she had run toward and the strange mathematics of how sometimes those turned out to be the same destination. "Yes," she said, "I would consider it." He turned to look at her and she was smiling, and she watched that shadow of a smile that she had come to love for its rarity appear on his face. "Then I would like to know," he said, "if you would like me to ask properly." "I would like that very much," she said. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the middle of the Wyoming plain with nothing around them for miles in any direction except grass and sky. And he stepped down and came around to her side and offered his hand to help her down. And when she was standing in front of him on the road, he held both her hands in his and looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said, "Charlotte Turner, I have been making this ranch work through sheer stubbornness for 2 years, and I have fixed every broken thing on it. But the one thing I could not fix was the particular kind of emptiness that a place has when there is no one in it who matters to you the way you should matter to people. You have been here 3 months and you have become the thing that makes the rest of it make sense. I would be honored if you would marry me." She said, "Yes, Matthew, I will marry you." He kissed her for the first time there on the road, and it was not tentative or uncertain. It was the kiss of a man who, when he has decided something, means it completely. And Charlotte held on to him with both hands and thought that 3 months ago she had $11 and a trunk and a stubborn refusal to be diminished. And somehow that had led her here, to the exact middle of nowhere, which was also exactly where she wanted to be. They were married 6 weeks later in Cutter Creek, in the small white church that served that part of the territory, by a pastor named Reverend Albrecht who had a magnificent mustache and the kind of enthusiasm for the institution of marriage that suggested he had never personally experienced its more difficult moments. Roy Calloway served as witness and cried in the way of older men who pretend they are not crying, making small dismissive gestures at his face whenever anyone looked at him. Danny Vega wore his good shirt and his best boots and looked extremely pleased with himself for reasons he did not fully articulate. The ceremony was simple and earnest, and the vows they spoke were the traditional ones, but Charlotte and Matthew each said them with the specific weight of people who have already demonstrated their meaning through action, and when Reverend Albrecht pronounced them husband and wife, the handful of people in the church made a sound of genuine warmth. The wedding dinner was held at the ranch, because neither of them had wanted a hotel banquet, and Charlotte had cooked most of it herself with the help of Mrs. Henderson, the neighboring rancher's wife, who had taken a decisive liking to Charlotte the moment she heard about the Connors' confrontation on the road, and said so with considerable frankness. "You told him no without blinking," Eleanor Henderson said approvingly, rolling pastry dough in Charlotte's kitchen the morning of the wedding. "I have wanted to tell that man no since he lowballed my husband for water rights in 1880. You have done a service to this whole valley." Connors had, in fact, retreated after Charlotte's confrontation and the subsequent land transfer to the Sheridan estate, which had removed his leverage entirely. He had not been seen on or near the Sheridan property since, and while Matthew held no illusion that the man had transformed into a reasonable neighbor, the immediate threat had diminished to a manageable distance. What Connors had done, unwittingly, was to make Matthew and Charlotte's positions clear to each other before they had found a way to do it themselves. He had been the stone that forced the river to take its true course, and while Matthew was not inclined to thank him for it, he could acknowledge the irony. The evening of their wedding, after the guests had ridden home and Roy and Danny had gone to the bunkhouse, and the ranch was quiet under a sky absolutely jammed with stars, Matthew and Charlotte sat on the porch he had rebuilt in March. In 2 chairs he had made himself out of good pine and looked out over the land that was now theirs together. "Tell me something you want," Charlotte said. Not what she wanted, what he wanted. She had learned to ask it this way because he was better at answering when the question was pointed at him directly. He thought about it seriously, as he did with everything. "I want the north fence replaced properly before winter," he said. "The current line is adequate but not sound." She looked at him. He smiled, the real one, not the shadow, the actual full smile that she had seen perhaps 8 times in 6 months, and each time it had struck her as something genuinely remarkable, like finding a geological feature where you expected plain ground. "And I want to learn how to be less solitary. I have lived alone a long time. I am still learning how to be in a house with another person without retreating into silence when something is difficult." "You are doing well," she said. "You are patient." "I am not particularly patient," she said. "I am invested. There is a difference." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat in the Wyoming night with the stars overhead and the ranch quiet around them, and it was the most peace either of them had felt in years. The first summer of their marriage was one of those seasons that seems, in memory, almost too complete. The grass came in well after the spring rains, and the cattle gained weight and the garden grew with an enthusiasm that Charlotte found deeply satisfying. And Matthew began, almost invisibly, to teach her the ranch the way he knew it, the way his father had taught him, not through formal instruction but through presence and repetition, and the simple act of doing things together until they were shared knowledge. She learned to read the weather from the mountains in the west, the particular quality of cloud formation that meant rain within 6 hours versus rain within 24. She learned which pastures held moisture longest in a dry spell and which ones needed rotation. She learned the names and personalities of all 38 cattle, which Matthew found both amusing and useful. He learned to consult her before making decisions that affected both of them, which was not natural to a man who had been the sole authority on his own land for years, but which he understood was necessary and right, and he discovered, actually improved the decisions. He learned that she had opinions about things he had never thought to have opinions about, not in a challenging way, but in the way of someone who notices details he had stopped seeing, the way a room feels, what makes a space welcoming, what makes work sustainable versus merely possible. Roy noticed the change in the house the way old men notice things, quietly and without making a production of it. He said once to Danny, while they were mending fence in August, "Place feels different this summer." Danny, who was 23 and thought about this kind of thing more than he appeared to, said, "Better." "Yes," Roy said, "better." In September, Charlotte discovered she was expecting a child, and the information landed on both of them with the weight of something genuinely momentous. She told Matthew on a Sunday morning, sitting across the breakfast table, and watched his face move through several things before settling into something she had never seen on it before, a particular still brightness, like light through water. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He came around the table and she stood up, and he held her with a care that was somehow both gentle and fierce, and she put her face against his shoulder and felt that particular kind of safety that has nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with the person who is holding you. "I need to tell you something," he said, into her hair. "You always need to tell me something," she said. "What is it?" He paused in a way that was uncharacteristic for him. "I am very glad," he said. "I did not know I wanted this as much as I apparently did." She laughed, which startled him because he had expected something more solemn, and then he was laughing too, quietly, which was its own remarkable thing. The winter of 1883 was hard, as Wyoming winters are, with a cold that arrived in November and did not relent until late March. Matthew laid in supplies carefully, the way his father had taught him, calculated against the length of the season and the needs of the cattle and the household. The ranch house that had been cold and bare when Charlotte arrived was, by that winter, genuinely warm, curtained against the drafts, the parlor chimney drawing cleanly, the kitchen stove efficient and well-tended. Charlotte spent the darkest months of the pregnancy reading, organizing the household accounts into a system so clean and clear that Matthew spent an entire evening studying it with the concentrated attention he normally reserved for weather and water, and she embroidered, which was something she had not done since her mother taught her as a girl. And she talked with Matthew in the long winter evenings with the ease of two people who have run out of things to hide from each other, and discovered that what remains is better than what was concealed. He told her about the dark past of the ranch, not just the land dispute but the years his father had struggled, the seasons when he had nearly lost everything, the loans he had taken and repaid through work so grueling it had aged him 10 years in 5. He told her about his own 2 years in Colorado, and what he had run from when he went there, which was the grief of his mother's death and the difficulty of watching his father diminish without knowing how to help. She told him about the suitors her father had arranged, and what it had felt like to be assessed for usefulness rather than loved for herself. She told him about the moment she had read the advertisement in the Missouri Courier and felt, for the first time in months, something that might have been hope. She told him about the hours on the stagecoach from the end of the rail line, the cold and the dust, and the vast emptiness of the territory, and how instead of being frightening it had felt like freedom. "I was so afraid you would be awful," she said one evening in January, the snow coming down outside in the steady, serious way that Wyoming snow commits to itself. "Was I?" he said. "You were disconcerting," she said. "You were not awful. That is a significant improvement on what I feared you would think." "What did you fear?" He was quiet for a moment. "That you would find out about the land situation immediately and leave. That I had made a mistake in the way I handled it." A pause. "That even if the land situation resolved itself, He stopped. "What?" she asked quietly. "Too used to being alone," he said. "Too set in it. That I would not know how to be with someone in a way that was actually good for them." Charlotte looked at him across the lamplight. "Matthew," she said, "you have been good for me every day since I arrived. I need you to know that." He looked at her with those eyes, and she thought about all the ways a person can be alone, even in a room full of people, and how rare it is to find the kind of presence that answers that particular loneliness, and how she had found it in the last place she had expected, at the end of a stagecoach line in a territory she had never been to, offered by a man who had answered her letter with 17 words. Their son was born in April of 1884, when the first grass was just beginning to come up, and the cottonwoods along the creek were budding out pale and delicate. He came into the world after a long labor attended by Eleanor Henderson, who had delivered babies on the frontier before and brought the calm competence of experience. Matthew spent the labor outside doing every conceivable task on the ranch at high speed, which Roy correctly identified as the behavior of a man who needs to move when he cannot control something. When Eleanor came to the door and said it was done, Matthew went inside and found Charlotte sitting up in bed, pale and tired and completely luminous, holding a small person wrapped in white flannel. She looked up at him and said, "Come and see." He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this person who had arrived. "He has your eyes," Charlotte said. Matthew looked at his son's dark gray eyes, still unfocused with newness, and felt something open in his chest that he did not have a name for, a largeness and expansion. "What do you want to call him?" he asked. "I thought William," she said, "after your father, if that is what you would like." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the thing that happened behind his eyes when she surprised him, when she did something that reached past his defenses and touched something he had not known needed touching. "Yes," he said, "William." Roy Calloway, informed of this decision, retired immediately to the bunkhouse and reappeared 30 minutes later with eyes that were notably red-rimmed and an expression daring anyone to mention it. Young William Sheridan grew with the appetite and energy of someone who intends to make use of the world. He was a serious baby who became a cheerful toddler, with dark hair like his father and his mother's dark eyes, and a way of watching things that suggested he was taking careful notes. Matthew handled him with an attentiveness that Charlotte found sometimes difficult to look at directly, the gentleness of a man who had always had more care in him than he had been given occasion to show. The ranch continued to grow. The cattle herd expanded as the grass held and the management improved. Charlotte's accounting brought them through 2 tight years with margins that would have broken a less carefully managed operation. They hired another hand, a man named James Cross who came from Nebraska and knew horses particularly well, and who became, in the way of good ranch hands, part of the functioning fabric of the place. Connors made one more attempt, 2 years after the wedding, sending a letter through a lawyer in Laramie claiming a rite of passage across the eastern pasture, based on a historical route he claimed predated the Sheridan claim. Matthew took the letter to his own lawyer, a capable woman named Margaret Oakes who had established her practice in Laramie in 1881, and who had a reputation for quiet precision in territorial land matters. And Margaret Oakes reviewed the claim and wrote a response so thoroughly documented and clearly argued that Connors's lawyer apparently advised his client to let the matter rest, because no further correspondence arrived. Charlotte met Margaret Oakes at a meeting of the Laramie Women's Aid Society, which Charlotte had begun attending when she visited the town on supply runs, and they became the kind of friends who think similarly and disagree productively and respect each other's intelligence. It was Margaret who told Charlotte about the push in Laramie for a territorial school, and Charlotte who organized the Cutter Creek families to contribute to the effort, and the two of them together who wrote a letter to the territorial legislature that was, by Margaret's account, the most effectively argued correspondence she had assisted with. Matthew read the letter and looked at his wife and said, "You should have been a lawyer." "Women are not admitted to the bar in this territory," Charlotte said. "They should be," he said, without any qualification, and went back to his coffee. It was one of the things she loved most about him, the directness of his fairness, uncomplicated by the social hedging that other men employed when they agreed with things that were inconvenient to agree with. The summer of 1886 brought a drought that tested every ranch in the valley. The creek ran low, and the grass browned early, and the water table, always the anxiety of the High Plains rancher, dropped 2 feet by August. Matthew and Charlotte had prepared as well as anyone could, having moved cattle to the northern pasture, where a secondary spring kept the ground wetter longer, and having maintained a water reserve in the storage cistern that Matthew had dug and lined with stone the previous autumn, a project that Charlotte had pushed for, and that Roy had declared unnecessary at the time and declined to apologize for being wrong about. The Hendersons lost a third of their herd. Several smaller operations folded entirely that year, and the families moved on to somewhere less unforgiving. The Sheridan ranch survived, lean and careful, with every animal they had started with still standing at the end of it. In September, when the rains finally returned and the creek came back up and the brown grass began to show faint green at its roots, Charlotte told Matthew she was expecting again. This time he did not go outside and work himself into exhaustion. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on it in his old gesture of steadiness and said, "Tell me how you feel." "Relieved," she said, "that the drought is over, genuinely happy about the rest of it." "Good," he said. He reached across and took her hand. "Good." Their daughter arrived in March of 1887, during a snowstorm that pinned them to the ranch for 3 days, and gave the birth a slightly improvised quality that a leaner Henderson managed with equanimity. Matthew was in the house this time, at Charlotte's insistence, and she held his hand through the worst of it with a grip that later left visible marks, and when the baby arrived and cried her first announcement into the warm kitchen, he looked at Charlotte and said, "You are remarkable." "I am exhausted," she said. "Both things," he said. They named the girl Sarah after Charlotte's mother, which made Charlotte cry in the quiet, private way she reserved for things that cost her something. Matthew held her while she cried, as he had learned to do, without trying to fix it or redirect it, just present, which was what she needed. William Sheridan, 2 years old, regarded his new sister with the suspicious attention of someone who has identified a potential competitor, and then, within 2 weeks, attached to her with a protectiveness that was almost comical given that she was an infant who mostly slept. Roy found him standing next to the cradle one afternoon looking at her with an expression of grave responsibility. "What are you doing, young William?" Roy asked. "Watching," William said, with 2-year-old seriousness. "Good man," Roy said, and went to find Danny to tell him about it. The years moved the way years do on a working ranch, with the rhythm of seasons and labor and the small accumulated dramas of a life being properly lived. The fence got replaced. The barn was rebuilt properly, taller and more efficient, a project that took 2 summers and that Matthew approached with his characteristic thoroughness. The kitchen garden became a full kitchen garden, and then a proper vegetable garden that supplied not just the household, but occasionally the Hendersons, and once, during a hard week, a family passing through from Kansas whose wagon had thrown a wheel. Charlotte continued to correspond with Margaret Oakes in Laramie about the school question and the broader questions of women's property rights in the territory, which were, in the 1880s, beginning to move towards something more equitable, Wyoming having been unusual among the territories in its relatively early recognition of women's suffrage. She wrote 2 pieces for the Laramie newspaper under her own name, which drew letters both supportive and hostile, and she read every hostile letter carefully and responded to none of them because Margaret advised it, and Charlotte trusted Margaret's tactical judgment. Matthew read every piece she published and never once suggested she should not, even when a letter from a neighboring rancher arrived implying that a wife's public writing reflected poorly on her husband's household management. Matthew had written back one sentence, and Charlotte had never been told exactly what it said, but the rancher had not written again. William started at the Cutter Creek School when he was 6, which was in 1890, by which time the school had real desks and 3 teachers, and a building that had been properly constructed instead of being held together by determination and seasonal optimism. He was a serious student who liked mathematics and struggled with patience, which his teacher told Charlotte at a parents' meeting with an expression that suggested she was choosing her words carefully. And Charlotte had not mentioned to the teacher that she found this hereditary, because the teacher did not know Matthew well enough to appreciate the irony. Sarah, who was 3 when William started school, had already demonstrated that she was a different kind of intelligence entirely, the kind that does not sit still well but notices everything, who could identify all the cattle by sight before she could read, who told complete and fairly accurate weather forecasts based on her own observations by the time she was 5, and who had Roy Calloway completely managed within about 18 months of achieving mobile independence. "She is going to run this operation one day," Roy told Matthew, who was watching his daughter instruct Roy on the correct way to approach the nervous roan horse, which she had arrived at through patient trial and error while Roy had been doing it wrong for 3 years. "She and William both," Matthew said. "Yes," Roy said, "but she is going to be the one telling him where to look." Roy died in the winter of 1891, quietly in his bunk, the way he had always said he wanted to go, without inconveniencing anyone. He had been old when he came to work for William Sheridan Sr., and he had lasted longer than anyone had reason to expect, powered by tobacco and stubbornness, and a genuine love for the land he had spent his life on. Charlotte organized the burial on the ridge above the ranch, which was where Roy had once mentioned the view was worth looking at. The whole of Cutter Creek came, because Roy had been an institution in the valley for 30 years, and Matthew spoke simply and well about what Roy had been, and Danny Vega, who had been on this ranch for nearly a decade now, and had become something between a hand and a member of the family, stood with his hat in his hands and said nothing, but held it together with the dignity of a man who has learned that grief is not weakness. James Cross became the senior hand after Roy's death, a role he carried with a quiet competence that never tried to replace what had been lost, but simply occupied its own space. Charlotte marked Roy's absence in the accounting books by adding his name to the dedication page at the front of the ledger, which was not an accounting convention but was hers. The decade turned. The territory of Wyoming became the state of Wyoming in 1890, the 44th state admitted to the Union, and it did so having already established that women could vote, which was not an accident but a result of precisely the kind of determined effort that Margaret Oakes and Charlotte Turner and a considerable number of other women had been engaged in for years. Charlotte voted in the first state elections with a feeling in her chest that she described to Matthew afterward as a specific kind of rightness. "Like a thing being where it belongs," she said. "Yes," he said, "that is exactly right." They were 43 and 34 respectively that year, and they were different people than they had been when the wagon had driven up to the depot in Cheyenne. Different but recognizable, worn in the good way that useful things are worn, the essential structure unchanged, and in fact stronger for having been tested. Matthew's hair had gone properly silver at the temples and was making moves toward the top, which Charlotte found distinguished and told him so, which made him look quietly pleased in the way he looked when she said things that mattered to him. Charlotte's dark hair was still dark, streaked through with gray that she declined to disguise, because it was honest, and she had arrived at a point in her life where honesty in all its forms was something she valued above most decorative alternatives. They sat on the porch on a July evening in 1891, after a day that had been long and satisfying in the way of days that end with everything accounted for, the two children asleep upstairs, the ranch quiet in the warm dark, the fireflies beginning in the grass below the yard, and Matthew reached across to take her hand in his, which was a thing he had done every evening for years and showed no signs of stopping. "I want to ask you something," Charlotte said. He turned to look at her. Even now, after all the years, the direct look from his gray eyes had a quality that required a certain steadiness to meet. "I want to know," she said, "whether you are happy." He considered it seriously, as he always did. He looked out over the ranch, at the rebuilt barn and the good fence and the garden and the well and the grass, and he thought about the photograph beside the door, which now had two more photographs beside it, William at 6 months and Sarah at 3 months, and one more that Danny had taken with a borrowed camera of all four of them in the yard on a Sunday morning that was slightly blurry, but was the best thing on that wall. He thought about a kitchen table and a lamp and a deed, and a hidden motive that had turned into something he could not have planned, and would not now trade for any version of the alternative. He thought about loneliness and what its absence felt like, not the absence of solitude. He still needed solitude sometimes, and Charlotte gave it without resentment because she understood the difference, but the absence of that particular hollow quality that an empty house has when the emptiness is not chosen. "Yes," he said. He looked back at her. "Completely." She squeezed his hand. "Good," she said, "because I am as well." They sat in the Wyoming evening and listened to the night sounds of the ranch and the children sleeping above them. And William Sheridan was, Charlotte thought, the most complete silence she had ever known. In the spring of 1893, she told him she was expecting a third time. He was 50 now, she was 43, and the news had a different texture to it this time, not less welcome, but held with the more careful hands of people who understood that life is not guaranteed. The pregnancy was harder than the others had been. Dr. Lawrence, who had established his practice in Cutter Creek 4 years earlier, and was a careful and capable doctor, told Charlotte in her 7th month that she should rest more than she had been and take no heavy work. Charlotte took this advice as seriously as she took all advice she trusted, which was to say she adapted rather than ignored. And Matthew quietly took over the kitchen for 3 months in a way that revealed he had been absorbing her methods for years. His cooking was competent, which pleased neither of them aesthetically but was perfectly functional, and he produced bread that was somewhat dense and stew that was unerringly good. And William, who was 9 by then and interested in everything mechanical and productive, declared it the best stew he had ever had, which Charlotte chose to find endearing rather than alarming. Their second son was born in October of 1893, in the early morning when the sky was just turning from black to deep blue, and the first frost of autumn was on the grass. Dr. Lawrence was there, and a leaner Henderson, and the birth was safer than Charlotte had feared and harder than the first two, but complete by dawn. Matthew held the baby and looked at Charlotte with an expression she had seen twice before in this room and that she could not quite describe, that particular still brightness, and said, "He looks like you." "He looks like a very new person," Charlotte said. "Give him a few days." They named him James, after Charlotte's maternal grandfather, who had been by all accounts the reliable person in her mother's family of origin, and after James Cross, who had been quiet and steady on this ranch for 10 years and who reddened impressively when told of the honor and said it wasn't necessary, and Charlotte said it was, and that was that. Little James Sheridan was a different creature from his siblings, quieter than Sarah and less intense than William, with a temperament so equable that Dr. Lawrence, checking in on the family 6 weeks after the birth, said he had never seen a baby who seemed so fundamentally at peace with existing. "He has your manner," Charlotte told Matthew. My manner, Matthew said, genuinely puzzled. The quality of being present without needing to announce it, she said. He thought about this for a moment and then nodded, acknowledging it. William, at 9, took his role as eldest child with the seriousness he brought to all things, teaching James to identify cattle before James could reliably walk, and explaining the mechanics of the water pump in considerable detail to an audience who had not yet developed the capacity for multi-step information. Sarah, at 6, took a more practical approach, which consisted of carrying James everywhere he expressed a preference for being somewhere other than where he was, which was frequently, and managing him with the same efficient calm she applied to the nervous roan horse. Charlotte watched her children and thought about all the things that had been required to produce them, not just the biological facts but the chain of events. $11 and a stagecoach and an advertisement in a newspaper and a 17-word reply, and a deed laid on a table, and a hidden motive that had turned out to be more honest than concealment. Just afraid, just human. She thought about her father sometimes, with the complicated grief of someone who has made peace with a complicated truth. Elias Turner had been a man who took things that did not belong to him, and that had been wrong, and the effects of it had required untangling by people who were not him. But he had also been the reason she had left Missouri, which had been the reason for the advertisement, which had been the reason for all of this. She did not excuse him. She simply placed him accurately in the ledger of her life, which was a thing she had learned to do from keeping actual ledgers, the acknowledgement of both debts and credits without pretending either did not exist. The ranch that Matthew Sheridan had held together alone through 2 years of stubbornness and loss was, by 1895, a thriving operation. 240 acres of good grassland, well-watered and carefully managed, with a herd of cattle that represented 12 years of patient improvement. A house that had been transformed from a functional space into a genuine home, not through wealth but through intention. A family that had been built in the specific and unlikely way that families sometimes are, out of an advertisement and a contested land claim, and 2 people who, for different reasons, had arrived at a point where they needed to be brave. Matthew Sheridan stood on the porch of that house on a September evening in 1895 with his wife beside him and his children inside, and looked at what 12 years of work and love and honesty had made. And he thought about his father, who had built the beginning of this from nothing, and about Roy, who was buried on the ridge above where the view was worth looking at, and about all the years of fixing things that had preceded the discovery that the most broken thing was also the most repairable. Charlotte leaned into his arm in the particular way she had, and he felt the familiar warmth and weight of her, the specific presence that was irreplaceable, that had been the answer to something he had not known was a question until she arrived. "What are you thinking?" she asked. Her version of the question she had asked on the wagon road, adapted through years to fit their easy understanding. "I was thinking," he said, "that my father used to say land was the only thing that could not be argued with. And I think he was almost right, but he was missing something." She looked up at him. "What?" He looked down at her, at this woman who had come to him with $11 and a spine made of iron, and a past that could have made her hard all the way through but had not, who had made curtains from cloth she found in a trunk, and planted a garden in a strip of ground, and organized a school, and voted in a state election, and filled this house with the specific quality of being known, of being truly known by someone who chose to stay. "The other thing," he said, "that cannot be argued with." She understood him. She always understood him. She turned back to the evening and took his hand and held it, and the Wyoming sky was doing its most elaborate work above them, color building from the mountains in the west and spreading across the vast plain, gold and rose and the deep blue that comes just before dark. And the ranch was quiet, and the children were inside, and James Cross was finishing something at the barn, and Danny Vega had his own small operation now, 12 miles north. Had bought it 3 years ago with money he had saved and advice he had accumulated working here. And the fence was sound, and the grass was good, and the well had never gone dry again after Matthew sank it deeper in 1887. And the loneliness, the particular hollow loneliness of a house without someone who matters, was a thing so thoroughly gone that it was almost impossible to remember its exact quality, the way you forget the specific pain of a wound after it has fully healed, the way the healed place becomes simply a part of you, stronger than before. William came out the door at 7, nearly as tall as his father already, with a question about something he was reading that turned into a 20-minute conversation about cattle breeding and territorial law, and why certain rivers changed course over decades, because that was William, who could not ask a small question if a large one was available. He sat on the porch rail and argued with his father, and occasionally appealed to his mother for arbitration with the confidence of someone who knew his mother's judgment was reliable, and his father respected it, which was entirely accurate. Sarah appeared briefly, holding James on her hip with the casualness of someone who has been carrying younger siblings for 6 years, and announced that James had found a frog in the kitchen which she had located and returned to the yard, and that supper would not smell like anything wrong, and then disappeared back inside with the efficiency of a person with a complete list of tasks and a clear sense of prioritization. Charlotte pressed her mouth together to keep from laughing and felt Matthew's shoulders doing the same thing beside her. "She is going to run this operation one day," Charlotte said. "Roy said that," Matthew told her. "Roy was right," Charlotte said. "Roy was right about most things," Matthew agreed. "He was wrong about the cistern." "He was wrong about the cistern," Charlotte confirmed. They looked at each other in the gathering dark and smiled, the easy and complete smile of people who have so much shared history between them that a sentence can call up years. The evening settled into night, and the stars came out above Wyoming in their hundreds and thousands, the great undimmed wilderness of light that the high plains offers in exchange for everything else it takes, and the Sheridan ranch lay under all of it. Its fence lines and water and grass and cattle and barn and house and people all in their places, all accounted for, all good. Matthew Sheridan had come to his father's land at 21 and learned to make it work through every kind of difficulty, cold and drought and financial loss and loneliness and grief. He had fixed the fence and the barn and the porch and the well and the chimney and the accounts and the relationships with neighbors and the contested land claim, and the threat from Connors and the kitchen garden, and every other broken or insufficient thing this hard and beautiful country had presented to him over the years. And he had found, in the end, that the thing he had most needed to fix had not been something on the land at all, and that it had fixed itself, or rather had been fixed by something that arrived on a stagecoach in March of 1883 with $11 and a trunk and a spine made of iron, and the specific particular irreplaceable presence that had answered the question he had not known he was asking. Charlotte Turner Sheridan came to stand beside him again on the porch, having settled the children for the night, and put her head against his shoulder in the dark, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together looking out at what they had made of this difficult and beautiful life, and the stars were out in their thousands above Wyoming, and the ranch was quiet, and the loneliness was so thoroughly gone it had become impossible to remember as its own thing, and everything was accounted for. And everything was good.